late start. We're just getting rolling now. So my name is Caroline Keicher. I'm an Associate Director of Policy Engagement with the Building Energy Performance Policy Team at the Institute for Market Transformation. To give a little background on the Institute for Market Transformation, we're a national best practices center for the design, adoption, and implementation of building energy efficiency policies. We're an advisor to state and local governments, federal agencies, and industry groups. And we're based in DC. And if you have any, if you want to explore our website, we're at imt.org. So today we're going to talk about building energy benchmarking and transparency policies and how the information that is coming out of those is moving into the market and what we can potentially be learning about how to get that data into the market more effectively, how to get people to uptake it, and how to really drive demand for energy efficiency in buildings. So just as a quick overview, we're looking at a map of current policies across the U.S. There are 11 cities and 1 county now that have passed required benchmarking and disclosure for large commercial and in some cases multifamily buildings. Those are quickly Cambridge, Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Montgomery County, Maryland, Chicago, Minneapolis, Austin, San Francisco, Berkeley, and Seattle. And so today we're going to hear from some recent research projects and some recent energy data visualization and communication efforts underway in Seattle, New York City, and Philadelphia. So very quickly, these policies so far are impacting over 56,000 properties a year, over 6 billion square feet of building energy space. And the questions we really want to focus on today, again, are how do we take this information that's coming out of this wealth of policy impacts that's coming out of all of these cities that are participating in this policy strategy, how do we turn that information into action on energy efficiency? How can energy benchmarking data be communicated more effectively to the market to help drive demand for energy efficient buildings? The question cities are really asking is, okay, great, we've got this data, we're collecting it. How do we get buildings to take the next step? And that's what we're going to try to focus on today. So just very quickly, again, we're seeing some interesting early results back from DC and other cities. Buildings that have been reporting over several years are starting to show energy savings in some places. And cities are putting a lot of effort into giving context to this data. So we're seeing really interesting energy efficiency reports coming out of New York City. They've tried to visualize and give context to the data as much as possible. We're seeing this in Chicago with a recent report of their first year benchmarking results. Seattle has put out a report that gives context to their local findings. Philadelphia has done the same. And so we're seeing some really interesting information come out at the city level. But when it comes to the individual building level, it's still a fairly simple rundown of metrics. So buildings individually are getting basically the elements that come out of an Energy Star statement of energy performance. And when cities are disclosing this information, it's taking the form generally of a spreadsheet that looks a lot like this. And what we're hearing from the market and from stakeholders in the real estate sector is that these spreadsheets are just not effective. There are folks who will dig through them, but they don't give the easily accessible, context-rich information that the market is asking for. And so today, we're going to hear from 3 studies or 3 attempts at starting to answer these questions of, okay, so what do we need? If the spreadsheet's not enough, if putting the data out into the market is not enough in that form, what do we need to be doing additionally? So we're going to hear from the Rutgers Center for Green Building, MaryAnn, Sorensen, Allacci, and Matt Campo on the results of testing energy marketing approaches to inform real estate market transaction decision making. We're going to hear from Debbie Slobe from Research Media and Nicole Ballinger from the City of Seattle on what inspires action, understanding motivations for improving building energy efficiency. And we're going to hear from Rich Free from the Mayor's Office of Sustainability in Philadelphia on energy benchmarking and what they've done with data visualization, individual performance reports, and the next phase of outreach. So with that, I'm going to attempt to turn this over to Rutgers. So let me unmute MaryAnn. Hi, MaryAnn.
Hello, Caroline. Thank you very much for the terrific introduction and the overview on the topic for today. As Caroline said, I'm Dr. MaryAnn Sorensen Allacci, and with me is Matt Campo, Senior Research Associate, and we're with the Rutgers Center for Green Building. And what we're going to discuss for today is the result of a research project to test the energy marketing approaches to inform real estate decision-making, particularly in transactions. And this project was conducted in 2014 and continues throughout this month in partnership with IMT, the Consortium for Building Energy Innovation, and the Department of Energy, and funded by the Department of Energy. And so, okay. Just briefly about the study, I want to introduce you to some of what we did there, and then I'll be turning it over to Matt Campo to give you a little bit more detail about the findings. What we did is we were interested in a very broad perspective of how the private real estate market can and does use energy data and energy information for their everyday transactions. And so we went broad. We engaged several real estate sectors, including owners, building owners and brokers, building service providers, utility services, tenants, and we were interested in characterizing how they use energy data in their transactions and also what their reporting needs were by transaction. So the reporting needs could vary, their capacity could vary, and we wanted to hear where the opportunities were to incorporate energy data into transactions. We also were interested in assessing and improving the usability of the public energy data tools, and we proposed some templates based on our understanding of how people could use energy data, and we wanted feedback on those templates. We thought we could, by developing this information, we thought we could inform marketing approaches for broader dissemination of energy information through the real estate sectors and, in effect, increasing literacy throughout the market around energy information and energy efficiency. Okay, so the way we went about this, and as you can see, there's a sort of a word cloud of more than 21 organizations that we engaged in the New York City, the Philadelphia, and the regional and national markets to hear what they had to say. So we did a broad brush of individuals. And we did in-person interviews and focus groups that were hosted in stakeholder spaces, so they were right in the specific market areas that we were interested in. We also did remote interviews for people that were geographically unavailable, but very interested. And we did conducted a snowball recruitment of participants by working with our partners and then also working with the network that we already had through the Center for Green Building, as well as through some of the suggestions that our participants had. And so through this process, we really retained a lot of these people throughout, so in sort of a longitudinal study to get their feedback at every step of the way. So we really think we've got some really valuable feedback and information to offer. So out of this process, we identified some key issues. The first was that energy costs are traditionally of very low importance in transactions. There are other things that outweigh, depending on the market, what those things will be, those variables will be, outweigh energy decision making. Also, the roles, capacities, and data needs of real estate sectors vary across transactions. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Matt will address that. Thirdly, occupancy and costs are critical performance measures. They're the heavy hitters, and as one of our participants said, occupancy is king. Okay, so that's the primary concern. And finally, contextual information is critical. That is the building uses, square foot, and some really general areas helps to create data validity for the different sectors. So what I'd like to do now is, and just to remind you that when we did talk with all of the different sectors, what we heard are a lot of the same themes. So we feel like, you know, the research had lots of validity because we got saturation in the areas that people identified. Okay, I'd like to turn you over to Matt now.
Great. Thanks, MaryAnn. So let's get to the good stuff. So what did we find? And what we found in terms of why the data is relevant and why the benchmarking transparency, sort of disclosure issue is relevant is for a couple of main reasons. The first one being that, stakeholders are finding that their customers are asking for this information increasingly. It may be very high-level scores and labels and certifications, but they're getting asked more frequently about energy performance. The second reason is for a perception of quality, and the third reason is having some level of transparency for validation. So what you have in front of you is a little bit of a discussion about what customers are asking, right? And customers are asking, owners are asking because the people that are investing in the owners' funds are asking them about energy information. You have different dynamics where tenants, whether or not they are large Fortune 500 tenants that have corporate social responsibility policies, right? Those types of folks are using their real estate portfolios to show evidence and progress toward achieving sustainability goals. So very relevant to large tenants, and in some cases relevant to smaller tenants in different sectors, right? Small startup technology companies and other folks are increasingly asking this, just as our stakeholders felt as part of their culture. So next slide, please. So one of the other things that we were trying to figure out was, well, what are they asking about and why? And a lot of the conversation centered around certifications, whether that was Energy Star or whether that was LEED or whether it was talking about how they both work in concert. There were two critical things. One was that our stakeholders felt that there is a perception of quality related to just undertaking these initiatives. So there is value to a point-in-time measure for each building or property that we talk about. There is additional value for showing trends of improvement in these data, right? Particularly for Energy Star, the ability to evidence that is very helpful. But even in the case where that may or may not happen, the sheer fact that benchmarking has sort of created a need for people to undertake this information, people perceive that that has sort of raised the bar in terms of quality management of buildings. And that really helps to lower any perceived risk of investment. There was some discussion about, well, if we know the management of the quality of the management is high, then I am somewhat more likely as a stakeholder to consider investing in a particular building or a particular portfolio of properties in an area, because I know that that energy performance of the building sort of has to be watched and monitored, as opposed to some other places where those types of policies may not exist. Next slide, please. And so the third reason was really for this method of transparency, right? For the ability for somebody to come into this market, maybe that's unfamiliar with it, be given information by a broker or by one of their advisors or by the owner, and have an independent sort of third party to compare that information to either validate or start the discussion about energy performance in that building. So not only are the different experts in that area providing them information, there's this perception of having sort of an independent party for which to cross-check and validate and create discussion around those particular measures. But there are some barriers to this as well, and the barriers tend to fall into the categories of the diversity of actors and their perceptions, the sort of history of how real estate transactions are performed, the translation of energy data into those sort of occupancy and cost types of measures, and then the ability to directly compare buildings. And so you see before you just a list of some things that we saw as barriers, but I think the critical things to pick out here are, there's a need to consider the diverse roles of actors, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in the upcoming slides. But there's also this critical need to be able to talk different languages, to be able to take engineering language of EUI and of different fuel consumption and things like that and translate that into a story about occupancy or rent or building performance or cost per square foot. Really important. And the other thing is that it's really important to be able to compare building to building, because for every different transaction, there are going to be different comparable buildings depending on all of the other different types of considerations that people are considering for that particular deal aside from energy. So next slide, please. So what we come out with at the end of the day is for all these different communication tools that folks are undertaking, right? Whether it's some of the report cards we're going to see today, whether it's some of the technology platforms that are being proposed, the critical things to think about when you as a city are looking at what do I need to communicate this information is who is supplying the information and what perspective does that bring? Who is the audience of the information? What perspective does that bring? And looking at them together, what knowledge and capacities do they both have, right? Do brokers and tenants both speak in terms of EUI, or do they speak in terms of Energy Star scores, or are they just looking for a label? In particular, where are you in the type of transaction or inquiry, right? So once you have the parties together, you have to understand what are they talking about. Is it a new lease with somebody just coming into the market and needing that information? Is it an existing lease that's coming up for renewal? All of these different decision points along the real estate life cycle where energy can enter into the conversation don't necessarily dictate, but should really think about or cause you to think about the appropriate types of marketing and communication templates that could be used for that particular message about energy. Next slide, please. Great. So one of the things we did throughout this project is we came up with a template, and we came up with a couple of these, presented them, workshopped them, and really the critical things that we heard, regardless of the format of the templates, was that it needed to contain two things. One that you'll see along the right-hand side is the hard and fast numbers and facts, right? Where is my property? What is its score? What are some of the performance measures, both in terms of energy and in terms of other either cost or different types of performance measures. The other thing that people told us was that they wanted to understand the story behind that, right? They wanted to understand what some of the improvements were, what some of the investments were, what was happening in those particular buildings that was providing information to correlate or validate the right-hand side of the document against. And you can create these for various different scales, right? We focused on a property template. There were also several other levels at a market level and, a couple different levels. But, really the critical thing here is to understand where a building sits within its comparative set, which could differ by each transaction. So next slide. So here's how we sort of situated that template within one of the exchanges, right, of which there are many. So we thought that a broker would be able to provide different types of detailed information through this template to a new tenant, right? Now, if this were a broker providing information to an existing tenant, this template might look different, right? If it was a broker providing market information to a general audience, then you might use a software platform for that. If it's the city providing information to an owner, the report card might be a more suitable communication template for that. So this is one illustration of combining all these factors together to really sort of think about and understand and look across cities to understand the formats for which they're finding really productive, helpful uses for these different types of communication tools. And so what we wanted to focus on lastly was, the context for which we were discussing of this information was providing information that would inform these different activities compared to what the typical conversation was about, right? The typical conversation that we heard benchmarking surrounded was related to either capital planning and retrofit type decisions, or it was related to operations management, peak load type decisions. There were a lot of discussions going on around what people could use energy management and benchmarking data for to manage those processes. And so what we're trying to talk about and what we're trying to understand here is providing information, not just data, but information and stories that are helpful and useful for the acquisition or buying and selling of properties and leasing of properties. And again, that information tends to be higher level. It tends to be score improvement. It tends to be labels. And it tends to be other high-level measures that start a conversation for folks to have it in detail about some of those capital planning and operations measures. And so at the end of the day, we looked at across all of our interviews and we said, all right, what could be helpful for everyone we've talked to start this conversation more related to those sort of transaction activities, those parts of the real estate life cycle. We heard a lot of value for the independent data provider, right? So this transparency function and situating the data as being held by the cities for that purpose was really important. As Caroline mentioned before, we heard a lot about the spreadsheets, and the spreadsheets don't do it because they don't tell a story. So what we heard was, regardless of the format, right, regardless of whether it's a report card or whether it's a software platform or whether it's a slip sheet that goes in a marketing brochure, it needs to tell a story and contextualize the information. In particular, we saw differences between how those stories were being told between people that were doing acquisitions and leasing and dispositions activities as opposed to the operations and day-to-day type work. To be able to provide consistency across cities was very important. Not that everything has to be the same, because folks felt that there are inherent differences in any market, right? And so we heard, the 80-20 rule applies here. If we have standard definitions and standard measures, we can deal with some differences in the way it's displayed. We can deal with some differences for including or excluding one certain measure, but definitely not for all differences in all the measures. And the last important thing was to be able to understand that the way the transaction sort of level activities operate, the capability to configure or customize the comparative set of buildings that you're looking at for these different types of mechanisms was really important. So whether you were a broker or an owner, your competitors could change every day depending on who walks in your door. And so the ability to have tools and things that represent and replicate the way that that process works were something that we heard loud and clear was a need. And so that's it. I guess we'll put our contact information up at the end here, but we'll move on, and then I guess we'll take questions. So Caroline, I guess back over to you.
Great, Matt. Thank you so much, and MaryAnn. So before we move on to the next presenter, I just want to say if folks on the line have questions, feel free to use the questions box in your GoToWebinar control panel to send questions. And if we have time at the end, I will ask those questions of our speakers. So next up, we're going to hear from Debbie Slobe of Resource Media and Nicole Ballinger with the City of Seattle. I will see if I can advance this. There we go. And now handing over controls to Debbie to take it away.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if I'm able to advance here. Okay. So with the City of Seattle, much like a lot of cities that are on this call and that have benchmarking programs underway, we've got a couple years now worth of data on the buildings, and the city is now very much focused on how do we take these owners and managers of these buildings to the next level? How do we get them to use this information and start taking action to make changes in their buildings? And so for this project, we worked with the city on focus groups and interviews with actors in the building industry, managers, owners, energy service providers that represented pretty much, all sizes, types of buildings in the city that are subject to those requirements. And we talked to about 24 individuals, and the information that we are going to present to you is based on those interviews. And just if you haven't heard of Resource Media before, we're a nonprofit communications firm. And I'm in Boulder, Colorado, but we have offices all over, including DC and Seattle and a lot of the other cities that are benchmarking today, San Francisco. And then joining me, excuse me, for the second half will be Nicole Ballinger with the Seattle Office of Sustainability and Environment. So the core focus of our focus groups and interviews is really to hone in on what drives owners and managers to make energy efficiency improvements to their buildings and what stands in their way. So this research was done with Seattle owners and managers, but we believe that the lessons learned here will be valuable for all cities, also utilities, energy efficiency and green building advocates, all those organizations that are working to engage the real estate community in energy-saving projects and programs like benchmarking. So we put this silhouette of Don Draper from the Mad Men TV show on the front of this presentation just to make a point that might seem obvious, but one that we tend to forget when we're talking with building owners and managers, and it's something that advertising executives like Mr. Don Draper know all too well, that in order to sell something, you need to know what makes your audience tick. What do they care about most? And then you need to pitch your appeal to those wants and desires. And in the case of the building industry, and perhaps every other industry, what makes them tick is, and Carolyn, I'm not sure if I have control over the slides. Can you forward for me? Profit. So building managers and owners make decisions primarily in the context of making a profit. Even someone who cares about sustainability and the environment needs to be able to justify those investments and projects based on proving profitability. Next slide, please. The model of how this sector thinks can really be summed up in this just simple infographic. Is it profitable? No. Okay, not going to do that. Is it profitable? Yes. Well, maybe I'll think about it. So in our work with the City of Seattle, and with this most recent project and one completed last year, we've talked with more than 50 property owners, managers, and energy service providers representing all types of buildings and markets, and all of them pretty much say the same thing, that profitability is the #1 reason for making building improvements. Whether that improvement has to do with improving energy efficiency or aesthetics, it has to pencil out. And even when we're talking with managers of like religious institutions, senior and low-income housing developments, nonprofit housing developments, you might think that they think a little more altruistically. On the surface they do, but pretty much if an improvement project doesn't pencil out, it's not going to happen. Next slide, please. So in Seattle, and maybe more so than other cities, sustainability is starting to factor into owners and managers' calculations about profitability. We found in our research that they're feeling more external pressure than ever before to make their buildings green. This pressure is coming from tenants, investors, also local government. They're feeling this pressure whether they like it or not, and that's what they need to respond to that in order to stay competitive in the Seattle market. Next slide. We also found in our research that reducing energy use is widely seen as a common sense strategy that owners and managers have for reducing costs and increasing profitability. So this is really great news. This means we don't have to do a whole lot of convincing that saving energy saves money, and that is a good business practice. These folks are already in that mind frame. And this is a word cloud of terms that focus group participants use to describe energy efficiency. So you see here a lot of practical reasoning, savings, tenant retention, payback. And you get the picture. Next slide. So a primary focus of our research was to hone in on who calls the shots. Who calls the shots as to whether or not an energy efficiency project is going to get off the ground, and then who holds the most influence over those decision makers. Of course, we tend to assume that it's the building owners, the ones that hold the purse strings, that have the final say. And they do. But we found that the real burden of proof falls to property managers. Next slide. So these are the people that have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the project is worth an investment. We heard time and time again that owners put a lot of trust into their managers and rely on them to make smart recommendations. The manager is basically the first decision maker. They're the gatekeepers, and if it doesn't get past them, it's not going to get to the owner. If they make a bad call, their jobs are on the line. And so this makes this group extremely risk averse. They're also under tremendous pressure. They have to keep both owners and tenants happy. They have really, really tough jobs. So our job should be to make their jobs as easy as possible. And our research revealed some possible strategies for helping property managers make their case before owners. Next slide. So some of these strategies include providing case studies of similar buildings making improvements. You heard from our last speaker that storytelling is key. Also promoting financial incentives even more than we're doing today. Providing advanced portfolio manager tips and trainings, to help managers become basically power users of portfolio managers so they can use that data to help make their case. Also making personal connections with managers. A friendly person at the end of the line can make or break projects, and that's what we heard a lot from the folks we talked to. And then finally, personalizing those building energy information and reports that we're looking at today on this call as much as possible. We found that owners and managers could really care less about the millions of dollars that everyone in the city can save, or all the owners in the city can save. They care much more about the thousands of dollars that they could save. Next slide. So strategy number one, providing stories of similar buildings. The proof, they say, is in the pudding. We heard over and over again that managers want to see examples of similar buildings undertaking energy improvement projects and getting positive results. They're not going to do anything if they don't think it can be done cost effectively, and no one wants to be a pioneer on a new program or technology. And on this next slide, you can see some of the quotes that people had, some of the things they said in regards to the importance of having stories of similar buildings. Let's give you a moment to read those. Okay, next slide. So promote financial incentives more. Financial incentives can really help decision makers pull the trigger on energy-saving projects, especially in Seattle because it has pretty low electricity costs, relatively speaking. And then upfront costs were cited by most participants as one of the major barriers to undertaking projects. So, everybody we talked to said that rebates and other financial assistance were necessary to get the desired ROI that they needed. And this next slide, again, will show you some statements from participants to that effect. So cities and advocates and utilities can be promoting these opportunities even more than they're already doing now, on their websites, social media channels, through partner and building industry organizations, workshops, meetings, you name it. Next slide, please. Also, lots of people talked about the challenges they had using Energy Star Portfolio Manager, but they said having access to really good presentable data on their building's energy use and trends can be very powerful for pitching energy-saving projects to owners. So for cities with benchmarking requirements, we recommend that they partner with organizations, if they're not already doing so, conduct benchmarking trainings to help users create charts and graphs using Portfolio Manager data. Cities could also be partnering with EPA to be creating tip sheets on how to create compelling graphics using the data that's in there. Next slide. And again, here's some statements from participants about the need for good data and the power of good data. Next slide. So making personal connections with owners and managers. Many, many times the participants we talked to mentioned just how instrumental a certain individual was that was at the city or local utility in helping them get their building benchmarked and take on energy-saving projects. They even remembered people's individual names. Lots of stories came out of, this person at the, the Seattle Help Desk, or this person at Seattle City Light or Puget Sound Energy, and they would say, in this next slide you can flip and see, without these people, these projects probably never would have happened. So having that sort of personal energy agent was really important to them. It was clear that having like a trusted personal relationship with someone who is knowledgeable and helpful can really go a long way in getting projects done. So, placing people's individual names, phone numbers, email addresses of city staff, on those profiles, on those outreach materials to owners and managers could really be helpful and make it feel to them that it's not just going into like a black hole, but they actually have a person that they can turn to. Next slide. And for this final recommendation about personalizing building energy profiles, I'm going to pass the mic to Nicole Ballinger. So if we could unmute her, who's going to talk about Seattle's Building Energy Profile pilot project.
Hey, great. Thank you, Debbie. We really appreciated the opportunity to work with Resource Media on this project. Really learned some fascinating things. So what I'll do is just walk you through the profiles and what we learned from our focus groups. So for the profiles, what you're seeing on your screens is the mock profile that we created for our multifamily focus group using EUIs, or energy use per square foot, and Energy Star scores that were typical of a medium-high use apartment in the Seattle market. And we did the same treatment for the office group, but of course used fake office data. So I'll just walk you through what you're seeing here on the screen. So on the left-hand top side, we noted who the fake building this was provided for, gave it some context of what type it was. And actually, I think this is an earlier, I'm just realizing this is an earlier demo, because where it says primary use, I know in what we shared says multifamily. And then in the box in the middle, we showed them what their energy use per square foot was, gave them a ranking out of all the other buildings they were compared to. So for multifamily, we compared them just to all of their multifamily properties. Then right below, the colorful bars that you see puts their energy use per square foot in the context of the other buildings. This indicates that this building is falling into the medium-high group. So not a terrible user, but could improve. And then below, towards the bottom, we listed the building's Energy Star score and explained what that was to them as well. So overall, the feedback we received on these suggests that the building owners and managers want this to be more personalized to their building and their specific saving opportunities. So what you're looking at, well, that's a good first step. It just really wasn't personalized enough for them or actionable to their building. Another big issue was that especially in the multifamily group, they didn't trust that it was really similar to them, that the comparison buildings really were their peers. So next slide, please. Okay. So what are some strategies that we might use to personalize these energy profiles? Well, one of the first things that the focus groups wanted, especially the multifamily group, was that they wanted to see their energy use trends. Again, they want to hear about their building. So we heard they want to know how they're doing year to year. Are they doing better or worse? And there's a couple quotes you can read there. So this is, as a city, this is an interesting suggestion, and we're certainly thinking about it, assuming that we actually have more than 1 year the data for the building. In many cases, we do now, since we're in our second or third year of reporting, depending on the building size. So in Seattle, though, we would also need to consider if the ownership had changed, since we don't have public disclosure, and we couldn't reveal the prior year's use if the building had a different owner. So fair amount of things to consider for that suggestion, but it's a great one nonetheless. So next slide. So the next thing is looking at personalizing the potential savings. So as Debbie noted earlier, they don't care that all Seattle building owners could save $55 million on energy per year. They want to know what they could save on their building. There's a couple quotes there. So this is an interesting suggestion as well. So we don't collect cost data in our benchmarking reports, but we could theoretically consider using some rough estimates of costs based on fuel mix and possible savings. So for example, we might be able to say, here's what you could potentially save if you moved from the high energy use to a low energy use. Obviously, estimating or predicting energy savings is a tricky business, so we need to be careful of how we present this. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, the peer group examples was another strong suggestion. So they're really not that interested in how their energy use compares to other buildings if they don't feel those buildings represent their peers. So they wanted to see examples of buildings and situations as similar to their own as possible. There's a couple statements up there. I think thank you. Okay. So when we did these mock reports, we actually used the biggest buckets that we had for the comparison group. So if you noticed, we used all the multifamily buildings, and that was over 1,000 buildings. Since we have quite a lot of multifamily and office buildings reported to the City of Seattle, it's very feasible to break these comparisons into smaller buckets. So for example, we may be able to create a report that is just comparing high-rise multifamily to high-rise multifamily, or for example, breaking out the affordable housing multifamily groups to other affordable housing. So this is something that I think is very well noted, and also something that other organizations have heard when trying to do reports like O-Power and their work. Also some of the business reports have heard that as well, that if people don't believe they're being compared to their right peer group, they tend to dismiss the information. Okay, so the last slide, please. Okay. So lastly, on the back side of the profiles, we provided really pretty general information about rebate programs and local resources. The focus group participants really wanted much more customized information, again, on rebates and incentives specific to their building type or usage. And they wanted that broken out, whether they were high performers, they wanted to feel like their leadership was being recognized, and that they weren't getting the same message that a low-performing building would get. As one person put it, the profiles lose credibility if it says take action all the time. So this is another suggestion that we'd actually been thinking about as we were pulling these mock profiles together. And we definitely think it's some great feedback to work even more with City Light and other partners on next steps depending on the building type and performance. So just a quick note on what's next for our performance profiles. So our next step is to try another version incorporating some of the suggestions that we heard, namely those that are feasible and don't necessarily confuse the messaging. We're obviously very sensitive to, as we start to incorporate more things, it could get confusing. And we're looking to seek some feedback on those versions, especially from the market rate multifamily managers and owners, since they were a little less represented in our focus groups. So I'll just close with just noting that these are just some of the ways that we're learning how to sharpen our pitch to building owners and managers. And we certainly have more recommendations to share with you, but not enough time. But we do expect the report to be out sometime in May. So thank you.
Nicole and Debbie, thank you very much. And now we'll move on to Rich, who should be unmuted now. And
I am indeed.
Excellent. We will see if we can progress here. And I will attempt to give you control. Apparently I have to stop moving my mouse in order for you to be able to move yours. So I will attempt to do that.
Great. Well, while you're doing that, I just want to say thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. And I really couldn't have asked for a better introduction than the first two panelists. That was, I was taking copious notes during both of those presentations, so I'm really excited to take some of those lessons learned back to the work that we're doing here in Philadelphia. Do I have control? Let's see. Did I do that? I think I did. Okay, great. So again, my name is Rich Free. I'm in the Office of Sustainability at the City of Philadelphia, and I manage our city's energy benchmarking program and work on efficiency in private buildings. So Caroline asked me to not spend too much time on context, so I'll go very quickly through my opening slides to basically discuss why we care about this. So here in Philadelphia, we have a GreenWorks, what we call GreenWorks Philadelphia, which is our comprehensive sustainability plan. We have a number of initiatives related to mitigating climate change and reducing our city's overall energy usage. So energy benchmarking has been a big piece of that for several years now. We're actually in the third year of implementation of our benchmarking program. Context-wise, 60% of Philadelphia's carbon emissions come from buildings, so this is a really big opportunity for us, and particularly, you can see on this slide, 14% of citywide emissions come from just the 2,000 or so buildings that are part of the currently benchmarked building set, which is about 2,000 properties. So we have data now on 2 years worth of benchmarking. We completed our last round in summer 2014. We've had high compliance. We've had the buildings that need to report. So we're kind of happy with the way that the program overall has been run. But we haven't seen to this point is kind of this next step that we're talking about today, which is, building owners have this information, but what do they do with it? So obviously all of the cities that are running these programs are asking this question, and I think we're all kind of starting to coalesce around some of the same strategies. So I kind of want to echo a lot of what we just heard from Nicole and Debbie in Seattle to discuss a little bit of how we're doing some of that same work here in Philadelphia. This is another context slide, but I think the important point to show here is, you look at all these buildings to the left of the slide, those that are below the Philadelphia average, those are all the buildings that really have an opportunity to improve their score, but kind of, as Nicole and Debbie were saying, to then save money. And that's really the piece that we are trying to bring back to building owners to help them understand that bringing their buildings up to this average level of performance is not just about reducing carbon emissions, which is great, for us as policymakers, but really it's about helping them save money and reinvest in their properties. So one of the ways that we've started to convey that information is, personalized building report cards. So we took this idea from Seattle when we first learned about it, I guess a year and a half ago now. And you can see that the format is fairly similar. So certainly, again, the lessons that we just learned from Seattle and on the focus groups that Resource Media ran are all, I think, applicable here as well. We've done a lot of work to begin the personalization process. So we do have kind of those rankings similar to what Seattle mentioned. We tried to go a little bit more granular and break up the sectors so that building owners did feel like there was a valid comparison happening here. But certainly one thing that we did hear from building owners as soon as we sent out these report cards was, a question about, where did this ranking come from? Who is in my sector? Are these people that I really consider a peer as a building owner, or is this just kind of what the city has decided arbitrarily is my sector? So we certainly heard from building owners that this was a great first step. Folks heard, or we heard from folks that they felt strongly that the portfolio manager tool did not go far enough in helping them understand the data that they were getting out of that tool. So they really felt like having this report card was important for them to understand, okay, so now I actually see how my building is scoring and getting a sense for how that compares to other folks around the city. We heard in particular that building owners were not interested in knowing how their buildings compared to this national average. So if you're a hotel in Philadelphia, you don't particularly need to know what your average score is in comparison to a building in a hotel in Seattle. What you want to know is how your building performs in comparison to another hotel in Philadelphia. So this is kind of going back to the idea of developing peer groups that you as a building owner have control over. And we heard this from MaryAnn and Matt earlier, so I really wanted to touch on that as another key point, and I'll show you some of the work we've done on that in a moment. I think the other key point, and I'm not showing this on the slide, but there's a back to this report card which does go into some of the utility incentives that we have available here in the city of Philadelphia, as well as our Energy Works program, which provides low-cost financing and technical assistance to building owners. So we have kind of started on this path towards getting building owners to understand the opportunities that are available, but to date we have not gone far enough. And I will talk a little bit more in a moment about what we're planning to do this year to really make that connection. The next piece that I really want to talk about, and I apologize for folks who have been on webinars with me before and have heard me blabbing about this. You can kind of tune out for a moment if you want to. But so again, back to this idea of letting building owners actually do some of the comparisons themselves. We heard from folks, and Caroline mentioned this at the outset, that the spreadsheet of public disclosed data is not enough. They are not interested in sorting through an Excel table, identifying buildings they think are their peers, and kind of doing some kind of Excel function to actually develop those comparisons. They need something easier than that. So we heard that loud and clear, and we had the opportunity to work with a local data visualization firm here in Philadelphia, Xavia, to develop a benchmarking visualization and mapping tool. So I'm going to walk through briefly what the process of developing that tool looked like, and then some of the opportunities that gives us as a city and as kind of a resource for our building owner community. So the work that Xavia did for us, the output is a map and some charts and graphs. So it maybe doesn't look like it's that personalized, but the work that they did that I found the most valuable was to bring in not only us as a city, but actually a number of other stakeholders, so academics, building owners and operators, service providers who work in the energy efficiency arena. They brought us all to the table and asked us essentially, based on this benchmarking data that we'd all seen, what would the ideal tool really provide you? So we started to get to some of the same questions that we heard from MaryAnn. What are the data points that building owners need? What are the things that they would want to do in terms of comparisons? And what would a tool look like that would really deliver all of those functionalities to the building community? So I'm not sure that we hit all of them, but we definitely got a tool that we're all pretty proud of here in Philadelphia. One of the first things that I wanted to mention on this is that we have kind of talked a lot about different kinds of data and how you can cut and slice it, and frankly it can be a little bit confusing. So one of the ways that we've tried to overcome this is to give building owners some options about how they can actually see this data, but not necessarily all of them. So there are points within the tool, and this is kind of showing one of the more complex areas in the tool, where you can actually choose all of the different data fields and get a sense for any given building. You're seeing here the Energy Star score, fuel oil use, energy use intensity, and you can toggle within various kinds of fields on this particular screen. But I think what we really wanted to start to do was get building owners and operators to think about kind of a subset of that data that they would actually really find useful as a comparison. So one of the other opportunities that you have within this, particularly the mapping area of this tool, is to select not only your own building, but up to 3 comparison buildings and say, these are the peer peer facilities that I'm interested in, let me now see how we compare on a few key metrics. And you can see the metrics here comparing two of our municipally owned buildings. So Energy Star scores, energy use intensity, emissions, and then the various fuel types was something that folks were particularly interested in. And the nice thing about this this comparison is that not only does it show you both of those buildings by the numbers, it also does this kind of normalized graphic of where you compared all of the buildings within the Philadelphia energy benchmarking set. So we think this is kind of a nice context-setting piece, and we're really excited to start really pointing building owners to this as we move into the third year of compliance. So I think I actually only have one more slide, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on this slide because I want to talk through some of the work that we're intending to do this year in Philadelphia that's really focused on bringing these tools back to building owners in a way that's helpful for them. So kind of one context piece is that we'll be adding multifamily buildings to the benchmarking set. In the past, it had really only been commercial buildings that were required to report. So as we do that, this is kind of an inflection point for us where we've had the opportunity as an office to take a step back and ask ourselves, is this the most effective way to run this program? Are there opportunities for us to, better reach building owners so that as we kind of bring in this new set of buildings, we're really making sure that we're getting toward our ultimate goal, which is using this benchmarking data to drive action, energy efficiency actions in buildings. So to that end, we'll be bringing on a new staff person who will hopefully be starting on Monday, actually, who will be specifically tasked with talking to building owners and operators about the performance of their buildings. So in the past, the way that what a lot of other cities call help centers has worked in Philadelphia is that our office has handled all of that work internally, the work of actually talking to building owners about complying with the benchmarking law, which has been a great opportunity for us to talk to building owners and understand their facilities, but frankly has meant that we have not had as much time to spend with any individual building actually talking through some of the challenges and opportunities in those buildings. So with this new staff person who will be specifically dedicated to this task, we'll have the opportunity to spend more time with each building owner talking not only about, okay, did you get through the compliance with, with benchmarking, did you submit your portfolio manager score? Great, let's look at it. But actually ask them, we sent you a building report card last year. Did you have the opportunity to look at it? Did you have thoughts on it? What did it say to you about the performance of your building, or what did it not say? And through that conversation, we hope to actually begin connecting building owners directly with the utility incentive programs that make the most sense for those building owners. And there's two other ways that we're hoping to make that connection. One of those is that we'll be working with an academic partner who is currently in the process of developing targeted recommendations for each of the commercial buildings that have reported over the past 2 years. So by combining benchmarking data with a separate data set that we have for building, essentially based on our Office of Property Assessment tax data, we will be able to develop a set of recommendations for each building, probably 2 or 3, that essentially says, based on the information you've submitted to us, we suspect that the 2 or 3 greatest opportunities in your facility are probably in interior lighting, or in a new boiler, or in, whatever it happens to be. And, obviously begin by ground truthing that with the building owner or operator and asking them if that sounds right to them, if they've done any work in that area recently, if it's something they've considered. And if it is something they're interested in, we can actually then connect that to the specific utility incentives that are available for that specific type of project through our electric provider, PECO, and our municipally owned gas utility, Philadelphia Gas Works. The other way that we're kind of approaching that problem, and this goes back to something that Debbie was saying, is this idea that building owners really are mostly interested in projects that result in a net profit for them. So what we're also in the process of doing is working with our utility partners to start to quantify some of the potential savings through those utility rebate programs, so we can start to develop at least an estimate of what cost savings by building might actually start to look like. So we don't want to overpromise on that. We know that those will be estimates and rough estimates at that. But we do want to begin giving building owners an idea of the scale of savings that are possible, and really start to get them thinking, you know, maybe this is a long-term profit opportunity for me, whether that's just through the energy savings or whether that's through, you know, the longer-term value of having a more efficient building. And I think we heard from MaryAnn that there is some possible market value to that, kind of aside from the energy savings alone. I think, like I said, that was my last slide. The only other piece that I wanted to mention, again, based on what I've kind of had the opportunity to be the last speaker and listen to what everyone else has talked about, is that we'll be absolutely taking a look at those report cards that I showed a little bit earlier as we start to do outreach for the year 3 of benchmarking here in Philadelphia, to tailor those message-wise, both to include kind of those more personalized pieces of information that I mentioned, but also really to focus the report cards back a little bit more on, you know, the personalized cost savings and profit opportunities for building owners. So I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about the focus groups that Resource Media and Seattle have run, and hopefully have you know, a product of our own here to share in the next few months that will be valuable to the benchmarking policy community, as well as the building owner and operator community at large. So again, that's my last slide, so thank you so much for the opportunity to speak on this, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Rich. Really appreciate it. And thanks again to MaryAnn, Nat, Debbie, and Nicole. So I'm going to wrap up here just with a slide or two, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So again, to our audience, if you have questions that you'd like to ask of the speakers, please add them to the chat box on your control panel for the webinar. So just to do a quick sum up, and you know, not to paint with too broad a strokes, but one of the things that we really felt like with this webinar is that there were a lot of great overlapping messages coming out of the efforts in New York and Philadelphia with Rutgers and with Seattle, and again with what Philadelphia has actually been trying on the ground. And so, you know, we saw some things, I think, that came up kind of again and again. Excel spreadsheets are not enough. Context and trends are going to be crucial moving forward. Personalized, actionable information is the most motivating for building owners and managers, and the ability to self-select those peer buildings and or really trust in the peers that were selected drastically increases the comparative value of those comparisons. Again, a lot of what we saw with Rutgers is that the information that's relevant varies a lot by what transaction or inquiry is taking place and who the audience and user of the data is going to be. So that has to be taken into account based on what kind of action you're looking for. Context is very local, but cross-city and cross-country consistency with data platforms and metrics can be incredibly valuable, both for owners and folks who are kind of looking at the data on a broader scale. Give information, not just data. And, you know, we've definitely heard over and over again that there are additional metrics that are needed other than what just comes out of Portfolio Manager. So, you know, whether it's a cost estimate or an exact savings, or not exact, but a rough savings estimate, and then, you know, vary the peer-to-peer specific, again, what the building uses are. So I think the remaining, or one of the big remaining questions for us and for cities is, you know, there's a fair amount here that falls under the city's purview in terms of how they are publicly facing the data that they've been collecting from buildings. But then there's a question of where does the city's role end and the private sector's role begin? Who's going to come up with the next best app that takes, you know, maybe some of those spreadsheets and makes them very interactive, very context-rich, combining those data sets that we know that are out there and putting it into visual and app and, you know, online resources that help people sift through and find stories in the data that help really motivate action. So with that, I think we've covered all the bases, and I'm going to unmute all of our speakers very quickly, and then I've got a few questions that I've been asked, and I think we've budgeted about 20 more minutes for questions, so we will do our best to cover them. First, I'm going to throw it back to Nat. Nat, there was a question about various templates that were created, which you thought were most or least successful in conveying the story of the data, or just a little bit more on maybe you could share, I think, where people could find those templates as well that you guys worked to create.
Sure. So, I think we're going to wind up posting these templates and these resources. I imagine we could distribute them back out through this listserv, but they'll also probably be available, on examples through our website and through the Rutgers Center for Green Building. But in terms of the use and the different parts of transactions, right, I think that we felt that the most valuable places were for property-level comparisons that would be used for acquisition, disposition, leasing types of transactions. A market summary similar to, what a normal broker like a JLL or CBRE would produce, where they have, rent by submarket and CAM charges and those types of things that they, already produce. Having a report at that level would be useful. And those are really the main two parts, but I think the critical thing was there are a lot of differences as to the level of information even within those uses. So there were a lot of questions about, well, should we just put a couple of measures into our own branded market report? Should it be a separate slip sheet within a sales portfolio that we have for our property manager? So while the templates that we put forth, I would say, and the templates that we'll post as examples will probably be, I would say, the Cadillac versions of those, all the information you could possibly provide. The really critical thing is to have that conversation, within the organizations or across the organizations to understand, what data can you include in a format that's most familiar to the transacting parties that will start that conversation. And that's the really critical point to pull away from it, I think.
Great, thank you. And one more follow-up for you, Matt. And I might go back to this diagram, but when you were conducting, or for MaryAnn and for Matt, when you were conducting the focus groups and the interviews, did you look much into which or where energy information could have the biggest impact in terms of the different phases of the real estate life cycle?
Yeah, so we talked a bit about where the information is most impactful. And, what we did here was, people aren't not going to lease a building because of a poor performance score. But we were having different conversations about, how, for example, if you were a Fortune 500 company or a large company or something like that, and you had a corporate social responsibility goal, if you were going to lease in a building that didn't have good performance measures or wasn't LEED certified, then you at least had to explain that decision, right? So people were asking the question to have the information available. It was not necessarily driving a lot of the conversations, and it may not have been, top 5, but there are the cases where people are having to answer at some point what the performance of that building is, and it's better to be getting the information up front than to have to chase it down at the end, particularly if you already purchased the building or if you already signed a lease and that you're then finding it out later, right? So providing some level of information up front was really important.
The other thing I want to add to that, too, is just the fact from the investment side, there was actually pressure on owners to report, to their status, their energy efficiency scores, and any other relevant data to the investment side of that, and that used to be GRESB at that time. And so that sort of triggers this line of thinking, is that you're reporting, and now if you understand that what you're reporting isn't, it doesn't show such great performance, then it seems to also lead to another sense that you need to be doing better.
Great, thank you. So next question is for Nicole. Nicole, when talking about trends and the fact that owners and managers are interested in trends, has the city considered partnering or using any kind of complementary program to Energy Star that might have more trend granularity?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it does get back to that question that some of the other presenters have talked about is, who is this card for? So certainly we've seen demos, and there are other partners like the Seattle 2030 district that are working to offer much more granular dashboard types of information to their members. So there are some things out there. But if it's in the context of the scorecard, who is really using the information? So I guess I'd say yes, we have, but then I would also kind of go back to saying we need to know exactly who the audience is for that information and then find the right tool.
That makes sense. Thank you. Another question, probably mostly for city folks, but perhaps for the whole panel. We talked a lot about what motivates action, and we heard that it's peer comparisons and it's market interest and it's having financial incentives available and good case studies and a lot of other things. But one of our questions was, to what degree are greenhouse gas emissions part of, if at all, a priority for these folks? Does it come up at all, or is it just not? Is it not part of it, or is it sort of a a bonus but not a critical part of the calculation?
I would say, any building owner that we would hear from that would bring that up, and it does happen, are usually folks who are already thinking about energy efficiency. We don't necessarily need to sell them on it. So, I think there is that group of, kind of progressive-minded folks out there who are thinking about the long-term impacts of building operations and how, their building fits into that. And we do hear from them, but that's not really where this work is. Those aren't the folks that we're trying to target because they're kind of already, I guess, in the bag for this work. It's really more about reaching the folks who don't know what a greenhouse gas emission is or that their building does have any impact on climate change.
Yeah, this is Nicole from the City of Seattle. I'd say it's probably pretty similar for our market. I'm thinking back to one of our focus groups where a few of the participants who I know were very engaged at their organization and sustainability efforts were really kind of the only ones who mentioned greenhouse gas as something that they talk about or get questions about. But Debbie, you may remember, I don't recall other folks really bringing it up during our focus group.
Yeah, not really, and I think there's also a little bit of a distinction too between like motivations and triggers. And I think we saw in this research in Seattle, and then another project we did last year too, that sustainability concerns are really ancillary and very secondary, and mostly external drivers, and not as much of a factor into the final decision making. It's nice. It has the feel good factor. It makes you feel good once you justify it, but it has to be justified with dollars. And then just a point about triggers. So something we didn't mention in our presentation, but there's a long list of triggers that actually, like, this is why we're going to do something. And equipment failure was, one of the top ones. People mentioned that, before we even get to the point of figuring out if this is going to pencil out for us, we're not do anything if everything's still working just fine. So, equipment failure, new turnover, so whether it's a lease renewal or new tenants coming in and they need to do something in order to attract them. I'm trying to remember some of the others off the top of my head, but motivations are good, but they're also, like, triggers are essential too, because it's not going to happen without that sort of acute, the acute need that comes up.
Yeah, from our perspective, it's kind of one of the unique things that we heard was, particularly from the sort of, either from the tenant side or from the institutional investor side, right? The need, just the need to measure for their own reporting initiatives, what their carbon footprint is through some of these other sort of international initiatives, right, global reporting and some of these other things, right? The capability and the need to do that sort of spurs the need to measure either across the investments or across the buildings that they're occupying. You know, so in order to attract that type of money from large institutional investors or to be able to attract, you know, large tenants or other folks, right, the need for measurement and the measurement capability needs to be there. Now, as to whether or not there's an actual performance improvement driver there, you know, I think there are probably other things that mitigate that, but the need to be able to at least report on it to show that they can meet their obligations to measure for their customers is really important in terms of greenhouse gas emissions.
Great, thanks. So another question about messengers. So, you know, we talked a lot about what form the data should take, what metrics are needed, how it should be communicated and visualized. And there is, I think, this tension between what is the city responsible for, or what should the city provide, and what should be delivered through other messengers. So, you know, have you guys put any thought into which of this is best coming from the city? Will folks listen to the city? Is there another group that tenants would be likely to listen to more? Any thoughts on how to disperse this message through the various messengers that are available to you, and which might be most effective for parts of this? And I think this, you know, I think this harks back to a lot of slides here to get through, but the kind of very last slide on, you know, what we know, but then also who's the right delivery for it, and where does the responsibility fall?
Yeah, so Caroline, I think from our perspective, you know, what we heard a lot was that the city as a messenger, the value in the city being in the messenger is its perceived independence in portraying this information from the real estate market, right? So, for example, if a city were to start combining, say, you know, CoStar data and other different data sources and trying to value real estate separate from, you know, the real estate professionals in that community, there might be some pushback as opposed to working together with them to say, for example, we've got, based on our benchmarking, you know, ordinance, right, we've got energy information that we're going to make translatable to you in certain forms, right? So we need to make sure, for example, that it's available in the submarket language, that the real estate, you know, rent information or transaction information is presented in, you know, and in a couple of different ways that allow the, you know, advisors in that market or allow the tenants or the owners in that market to pick it up and add stuff on top of it in order to show and enhance their expertise, really. You know, it helps them look good and simultaneously allows for an independent validation function to say, okay, you know, owner such and such is saying that the building performs in this way, and I have the city's data that either corroborates that or is very different from that. Now, that is not necessarily saying one is right and one is wrong, but there needs to be but driving the question to be asked there about why are they different is a really important function of holding this data at the sort of city level.
And if I can just add to that, and Rich and we and Rich basically embarked on a very short research survey, if you will, of some of the participants, and again, we were able to engage people throughout, you know, the whole year on this project. And what we heard from the people that we asked to visit the Philadelphia visualization tool is that people were overwhelmingly bowled over by the effectiveness of the site. Okay, so their feeling is that it was usable, that it was well done, it was attractive. So that was the first, you know, with perhaps the exception of one person who said, I need building use information, to know, if this is relevant to me or not, But for the most part, there's a sense of it, as Matt said, that it's an opportunity for an independent source to carry this data and for, as a tool for other stakeholders to compare against.
Great. This is Rich. I'll just add one piece on this, which is kind of this question of what maybe is beyond the city, or what other organizations, what role they could play. So I agree completely that there is value in the city being kind of the independent arbiter and kind of the keeper of the data. I think for me, the place where the advocacy community and some of the real estate groups, I'm thinking of, like local chapters of the Building Owners and Managers Association, those sorts of folks, they can really play a role in, making the case for sustainability as a core business value. That's something that we've seen happen more and more here in Philadelphia. We have a local organization that's kind of a dedicated sustainable business network. There's a lot of, I think, momentum towards that as an idea, which gets back to this question of, at what point will we see building owners actually asking about carbon emissions? And I think, that maybe we'll get to that point as you see that generational shift occur. But I would love to see, these groups kind of become even greater advocates than they already are for this work. And I think there's an opportunity for them to be a voice outside of the city that's really pushing for building performance.
Fantastic, thanks. So another question for Nicole and for Rich. In terms of putting together your report cards, did you have to access any additional utility data sets or other data sets to put those together, or did it all come from the data that was reported to you through the ordinances?
Yeah, this is Nicole. That's a good question. Primarily, ours is 100% from the data that was reported to us. I think if we were to narrow some of them down or add some of the features in that at least we heard are of interest to our focus groups, we might need to access some other data sets. But the initial take was purely from what was reported. And our analysis research, obviously, to show what the different energies per square foot quartiles.
Likewise, in Philadelphia, it was almost entirely benchmarking data, a little bit of the Office of Property Assessment data set that I mentioned earlier. We would love to get more granular data from utilities. That hasn't happened yet, but I think, if we did get to that point, that would be certainly something that building owners and managers would find valuable, to add to these report cards.
Great. And another question, which may in fact be a little bit more of a suggestion, because I think the answer is no, but we were asked, is there a database being built or developed that organizes and collects the average cost of typical building improvements and has, outputs from those costs? I know we have a lot of case studies out there, but have you guys thought any about, is it something we need? Is it something that exists in pieces? Yeah, I guess I'll just leave it to that.
That sounds like a great Department of Energy project if anyone from DOE is on the call.
Yeah, I mean, Rich, I was just going to respond to that. I know that there are a number of different tools that are sort of either in development or have been developed to look at some specific types of things, right? Whether it's, this issue about different sort of mechanical retrofits or different sort of mechanical things or materials. So there are a number of different tools. I think one of the things that we're looking at coming out of this is, one thing that some folks said to us is that even an imperfect measure of cost would add some value to us being able to understand and translate, what does it mean to have a 3-point change in an Energy Star score, right? Is that a $100 to $500 question? Is it a $100,000 to $500,000 change? I mean, what's that range mean in terms of dollars? And the capability to do that may be there in bits and pieces, but sort of needs to be coordinated and brought together in some way to really make that translation from these, energy measures to measures that the market will pick up and understand, at least from a level of magnitude perspective of what folks are talking about.
Great, thanks. DOE, I hope you're on the line and we're listening. So I think probably a last question to Debbie, Nicole, and Rich, as this is from a building owner manager in Denver, and they were wondering what major obstacles did you face when trying to build your report card or platform?
Sure, this is Nicole. I'll go first. So, I think one of the biggest obstacles really is just the technical one of being able to produce a piece that's customizable to a number of different, to thousands of different building owners. Is just finding the software for that, and the time. For us, it's also a challenge to decide, who can we send these to. Getting them into the right hands. We don't have public disclosure here, so we have to be much more careful about getting these to the owner, or at least the person that had the portfolio manager account. So there's a lot of them are really more technical hurdles, and then just the larger understanding, what's the best thing to communicate and what really works for folks, which was the purpose of this study.
Yeah, I would echo all of that entirely. I don't think I would add anything to what Nicole just said.
Great. Any last thoughts or comments from any of our speakers? Any dying, essential bits of wisdom you'd like to share before we wrap up? All right, I'll take that as a no. So I want to thank all of our speakers again for a really fantastic presentation. MaryAnn, Matt, Nicole, Debbie, and Rich, you guys have been really great, and I really appreciate your time and lending your expertise to us in this audience. We will get permission from speakers to share slides, and if we can get that, then we will send that out to everybody who registered for the webinar. We also recorded the webinar, so we'll be making that recording available. It will likely go out in our next IMT newsletter, and we will also try to send follow-ups to everyone that attended and let you know where you can find that in case you want to watch it again or send it on. So thank you, everybody, very much. Again, appreciate your time today, and hope to see you on the next IMT webinar.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you, everyone.
Caroline.
Bye. Good working with you.
Bye.